Welcome. This is Catherine Trotter, and we are back for another edition of the Shift Podcast Show. And today's segment is going to be absolutely phenomenal. Today we're with Steve Glaude. I'm telling you, it's going to be amazing. So, what I want everyone to do, I want you to share this link with your entrepreneurs, with business individuals that you know in the community, leaders in the community, because he is a nationally recognized leader in our community that spans from economic development with more than 45 years of experience, spanning from government, nonprofit, philanthropic, and private sector leadership. He serves as the president and CEO of the coalition formerly known as the CNHED, where he leads policy, advocacy, and organizational strategies to advance affordable housing and economic opportunity forward. Welcome, Steve. Thank you so much for being with us on today.
Thank you, Catherine, for having me.
Absolutely. You know what intrigued me was when you shared the white paper with me. And for those that have not had the privilege in reading it, I just want to share, and I'm going to share more about his background because it's absolutely amazing and the impact that he's made in our community. He recently released a white paper this February of this year entitled "Assets Are Not Wealth: Reclaiming Asset Development and Clarifying What Wealth Building Requires." What stimulated you to write that paper?
You know, it's a really great question. I've asked myself a couple of times how I got into that space. And I think it comes from me being involved in the work that is both asset and wealth building, more precisely being involved in a lot of work that is supposed to result in economic mobility. But it also grows out of being in a lot of spaces where our disparity awareness has grown.
Mm-hmm.
If you look back historically, our community has always had proximity to disparities around incarceration and education. And in more recent years, our awareness around wealth disparities, but most recently, health disparities, but most recently, there's been a really strong focus on the racial wealth gap in this country. And one of my observations has been that these disparities, some of them have bothered us over the years. I think in some ways we've grown to accept some of them. So we've accepted the difference in incarceration rates between African Americans and white Americans. We've even accepted health disparities, been bothered by them, tried interventions. But my observation has been that the wealth gap has been the disparity that has bothered both good and indifferent America when the numbers have begun to come out. And like everyone else, you know, you look in DC, there's a reported 81% wealth gap that's bothersome. And all of us have said somewhere between, oh my gosh, and what can I do? And then gotten busy and aligned ourselves with solutions, programs, services, and interventions. And so I think we lost kind of sight of what we're talking about when we mean wealth. And one of the things I've noticed leading a nonprofit, supporting many other nonprofits who are working in this space, one of the things I just begin to notice over time is a lot of services, a lot of grant programs, a lot of interventions have shown up as wealth building strategies.
Mm-hmm.
And as time went on, I looked at some of these things that include financial literacy and home ownership and owning a business and other things, and just started asking myself, these are great things, these are needed things, but do they actually lead, are they definable assets of value? And then the second harder question is, do they in any way actually lead to wealth?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I'd love to say in drawing this differential, the intent is not to devalue or demean the importance of assets in our lives. In fact, it's to maybe highlight that asset development is much more available to a broader part of the population than is actual wealth. The other thing that made me initially want us to caution ourselves about using these terms interchangeably is that we shouldn't have a dual definition of wealth for people of color and white Americans.
Mhm.
Whatever it is for one, it should be for the other. And we should not have this panic rush to a finish line to say we have done what we're going to do in wealth building or we're closing the racial wealth gap.
Absolutely. And for those of you are tuning in, at this point in time, you just heard a snippet. We have more to the conversation as we continue to engage one another. So I want you to take a moment and I want you to share this link with your community. I want to read more about Steve's background. Steve has held senior leadership roles at the local and federal levels, including serving as the Director of Community Affairs for the District of Columbia, where he oversaw 13 agencies. Earlier in his career, he had held a senior position at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, including Deputy Assistant Secretary for Planning and Community Development, along with being the Deputy Undersecretary for Intergovernmental Relations. So some of you are saying, who are we having this conversation with? I want you to know the breadth of his background, that as he wrote this paper, he brought all of his knowledge, all of his expertise, all of his wisdom to the table as he was writing this paper. And when I was reading it, towards the front of it, you had shared that you released it at the Birmingham Business Resource Center.
Yes, the A.J. Gaston conference, which is a conference in Birmingham, held every 2 years. A.J. Gaston was, I believe, the first Black millionaire in the city of Birmingham, and he captured business principles that could lead to wealth, that could protect assets. And in honor of him, they have a conference every 2 years. And I was actually commissioned by that conference to take the ideas that I had been sharing in speeches and meetings and panel discourses and formalize some of the thought into the white paper that was presented at that conference. It was a great conference.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely powerful. And when was that one that you attended? That was recent, of this year, or?
No, it was just last month.
Okay. So
down in Birmingham, it was a really great convening of business leaders, governmental leaders, corporate and philanthropic leaders, financial sector leaders, to have a whole day of conversations around things related to economic development and community economic development and business development.
Absolutely. And when we had an opportunity to meet, and then you were sharing with me about the paper, and then when I had an opportunity to read it and digest it, and just, some of my takeaways, as I even, emailed you, the difference between the asset and wealth. And sometimes you mentioned in the paper that there was a blurring of the lines, and speak a little bit more to that.
I had to really, since I kind of invited the fight, for lack of a better way of putting it, I had to really look into, seek other people's opinions, do a little research to really get a definition of an asset and wealth. And really the critical element on the difference between assets and wealth is how they perform. So assets are things like cash, retirement accounts, homes that you own, businesses that you own, contracts that you own. And how they perform in our lives is they absorb shocks. So if you have some assets, and let's say you have a period of unemployment, that asset can insulate you from harm. But assets alone don't aggregate into wealth. Protected assets do that. And so assets are things that you own that are of value, that enhance your life. So I would say one of the differences that I've learned to say about the difference between assets and wealth is assets enhance your life, where wealth enriches your life. And performatively, what wealth is a suite of assets that work for you irrespective of the conditions that you face. Somebody put it to me this way, actually at the conference, somebody said, assets are there to protect you from harm. Wealth is making money for you while you sleep at night. And so wealth would include savings that you never have to dip into. Wealth would include transferable assets from one generation to another. It would include cash levels that actually build something substantive because of interest accrual and things of that nature. And so one of the things that's important to make this distinction about the difference between assets and wealth. Asset accumulation tends to put the responsibility on the individual. So an asset is a savings account, but you have to spend frugally in order to increase your savings account. It's a home investment, so you may have to save your money to get a down payment. You may have to make payments on time. All of that is personal behavior, whereas wealth creation relies more on changes in the system. Access to fair capital, changes in the tax codes, non-discriminatory home ownership opportunities where you're not redlined out of certain neighborhoods. Wealth accumulation puts a burden on systems reform, whereas asset development is more responsibility on individual behavior. The other thing that's important to note is, and this is the reason why I really kind of tried to draw attention to it and call this out, asset development is more available to a large number of people. We should reclaim asset development as something valuable. Financial literacy is valuable. Home ownership counseling is valuable. Down payment assistance programs to buy housing is valuable. And we should not diminish the importance of those in our lives. There's a smaller group of people of color who have insulated assets that could be treated through these systems change that actually lead to wealth. What I don't want to see is a loss of focus on real wealth building because we're doing all this other stuff over here that is actually asset development that we're calling wealth building.
Absolutely. And for those that's watching, you are tuned into the Shift podcast show. We are right now engaging in a conversation with Steve. Also, I want to highlight some other notable things of his career is that his work also at HUD included supporting the passage of the National Affordable Housing Act. So we're talking with the gentleman with a wealth of wisdom, but also passion for our community to make sure that we are educated and really understanding the difference. This whole conversation is about understanding the difference with asset and wealth, and how do we really take this information and implement it right in our communities, in our businesses, at the dinner table, right? Making sure this information is disseminated to the next generation. When I was reading the paper, and again, I encourage everybody to take a moment to read it as well. You also had a line in there. It says how wealth is shaped by policy, markets, and institutions, which is kind of like what you were just talking about. Mm-hmm. Elaborate a little bit on the market section.
So the market section has all to do with the availability and the access that people have to navigate everything from owning a building, buying a home, starting a business, accessing capital. Those are what I call the system-based things, the market-driven things, which are influenced and controlled by policy as well as practice. Mm-hmm. And so, again, putting some of the burden on the systems that individuals and families have to navigate is really, really important. And again, if we are checking all of our boxes because we're doing financial literacy and home ownership counseling and, small business lending and mortgages and those things, we're diluting the attention that should be kept on the systems that people have to navigate, that give them an opportunity to insulate their assets, but also aggregate their assets into wealth.
And that brings it to another point in your paper where you talk about stability versus pathway. You said both serve purpose, but within the Black community, a deeper conversation about pathway is not discussed. Talk about the stability versus the pathway, which you're already engaging on. But for those that haven't read the paper, what is your viewpoint on why you wrote that part in the paper?
So stability is something of great value. We shouldn't diminish it. A family not losing their home because they have savings. They may, somebody may get sick. They may have a period of unemployment, but with savings, you can still keep those mortgage payments. That's having assets that make you stable, and that is vital to us, and it needs to be more widespread. But pathways mean that once you are stable and you have assets that have accumulated, that you can get those assets working for you in ways that expand either the amount of money that you have in savings, deeper investments in retirement, not just owning a home yourself, but actually owning other properties that you have working for you economically, which many people use real estate as a pathway to increasing, to growing their assets into wealth.
And that's
The other
why
thing,
in your paper you talk about compounding benefits.
that's right. Um, Assets insulate, wealth compounds. I mean,
Mhm.
that is the kind of the short math. The other thing that I mentioned, and I don't want to jump ahead of you in case you were going to get there, is the importance of community assets.
Mhm.
This is one of the things that has really plagued our community for decades, if not centuries. And we always talk about the dollar turnover. So I'll use this, what I think is a really graphic example. Let's say we are fortunate enough to have a Black grocery store, and I go into the grocery store and I buy $10 worth of potatoes. So that my dollar has turned. But if that Black grocery store owner has to go to a white food distributor or white farmer or an outside source, that money then has turned over once and has left our community. In fact, one of the speakers at the AJ Gaston conference, I believe I might get the hour number wrong, but I believe he called it the 6 hour dollar. And he
Mm.
basically said that our dollar stays in our community for 6 hours and then it moves out. So building community wealth is a set of strategies where we can self-serve and
Mhm.
retain our resources within the community. And it's important to focus on community wealth as much as individual and family wealth, because community wealth has plagued us for decades as well.
Absolutely, because it goes hand in hand, making that impact in the community, making sure that dollar turns over and stays within our community to create that long-term impact. What are some ways do you think we can expand on making that community impact?
I think we have to be, first of all, committed. And I also think that we have to be strategic. I'll give you an example. Here in DC, we work with a local supplier program, and
Mhm.
we have built the will within our universities, our health systems, our utility companies, our airport authority, our metro system to spend more of their procurements locally in DC.
Mhm.
So they're hiring um, minority and local construction companies, electrical engineers, catering services, maintenance companies, communication firms. But the work only sits in the service side.
Mm.
And the reason is because we have no manufacturing in DC and we have no distributorships in DC. So, one way to keep our large anchor institution dollar in is to
Mhm.
strategically invest in creating at least distribution companies. DC is a small community land wise. We're like 11 square miles. So, we don't have a lot of land to build manufacturing. We
Mhm.
probably don't have the um, environmentally enabling environment to do that,
Mhm.
but we could get more strategic about investing in distributorships. So imagine a local company that was selling hand soaps to 17 university and hospitals. That
Mhm.
company would do well, and we have the ability, I think, to create that agreement to purchase
Mhm.
if we had that. And so holding community assets means developing strategies around who can provide the needs that the community has and bringing the provision of those needs closer to home.
Absolutely. And while you're talking about community wealth, I'm going to read an excerpt from your paper. Community wealth is not about adding up individual assets with a neighborhood, to your point. It goes on to say it's about neighborhood businesses, land, real estate, and institutions being controlled in ways that keep their economic value within the community rather than export it to large corporations or entities. So that just supports everything that you were just talking about.
Mhm.
For those of you that are just tuning in, you are tuned into the Shift Podcast Show. We are having a conversation with Mr. Steve. He's the president and CEO of the coalition, which is based in Washington, D.C. As we continue with this conversation, talking about community wealth, community building, there are a lot of initiatives the coalition does. Share a little bit about that for those that may not know.
So our primary value to our members is policy and advocacy. We advocate for homelessness prevention, affordable housing, workforce development, small minority and women's business development in the District of Columbia. But that's advocating for others to invest is not enough. So we operate 6 high impact initiatives that range from the Landlord Partnership Fund, which we manage, which is a risk mitigation fund for landlords to get them to take risks with families who have eviction histories and credit scores to lease them up. We guarantee families registered in this program up to 5,000 in reimbursements to these landlords for either rent that is lost or damages to the unit. It's proven to be a huge incentive. We've registered over 4,000 families. We also have a senior home repair program funded by Amazon to provide up to 50,000 in free home repairs to seniors who are at risk of having to move out of the District of Columbia because they can't keep up with taxes and repairs. We can't pay their taxes, but we are providing them free home repair. And then our local supplier initiative, our DC Community Anchor Partnership, is another program that over the last 8 years, after providing strategies and relationship development between our large anchor institutions and our small business community in DC, we have actually gotten our universities, hospitals, utility companies, airport authority, metro system to provide a new 1.5 billion in procurements to local businesses and 946 million to African American businesses in the District of Columbia. And there are a couple of others, but those are our major programs.
Major. And for those that haven't been to their website, go to the coalitiondc.org. Again, that's the coalitiondc.org. And when you go to their website, you can also subscribe to their newsletter. So we're going to go back now and dive more into the paper, your white paper. There was a component in there that says how asset building game came to be framed as wealth building. You talk about nationally, the gap widened steadily beginning in the 1980s. And then by 2010, the scale of the wealth gap moved from an economic trend to a defining feature of the American economy.
Yeah, it's true. I watched it happen. I lived through it. I was in some ways a part of it. There was a period, I refer to it as the period of disparity awareness. Whereas I said in the early days, we've long time known about disparities, racial disparities and incarceration and education. But we went through a period starting I don't know exactly when it started, but I want to say around 2010, maybe 2012, where more studies on disparities began to emerge. So there was access to job training, there was home ownership, there was home foreclosure. I laughingly say that in DC, one day a sleep gap study popped up in my inbox. And I kind of laughed at that one. I said, boy, I could have saved money on that. I've always imagined white people slept better than I do, or than we do, were the case. But the wealth gap study is the one where I witnessed panic across the system. So when these wealth disparities started coming out, and they weren't just done nationally, cities had their own wealth gap studies. I'm sure New York had one, DC had one. I think most major urban cities had one. And my observation was that wealth gap study is the one that bothered us the most. Because we could look back and say for the last 60 years, we've had government programs, we've had philanthropic programs, we've had strong community-based organizations, operating programs, we've had all types of interventions, and yet this gap has grown despite, hundreds of categorical federal grant programs and all types of nonprofits emerging and philanthropy stepping in and stepping up. And so it suggested to everyone that it wasn't working, that we weren't getting something right, that we were overlooking. And that's fine. I think there's a difference between urgency and panic. And what I watched happen was urgency transform into panic. And the result of that panic was everyone starts saying that everything were doing was wealth building. And that's what really got my attention. It's like everywhere I turned, I would see on a philanthropic website, a bank website, a government website, wealth building strategy. And I, like everyone else, kept going and saying, that's great. We're going to do more. We're going to do better. And then something made me pivot and turn my face back into the wind and say, wait a minute. Is all, and maybe even more precisely, is any of this stuff actually ever going to lead to wealth? I can honestly say the vast majority of it is not going to lead to wealth. And I've had people say to me, oh, well, Steve, that's just what we're saying, or that's just how we're labeling it, or that's just how we're branding it. And so I said, well, That's fine. Appreciate you admitting it. But is there any harm being done? And I
Mm-hmm.
would say there is harm being done. And I think about it, I don't know that I'll capture it fully, but I can categorize the harm that's being done. One is, are we letting ourselves off the hook too easy? Are we diluting what we can actually do to build real wealth by saying things that are asset development are wealth building? Are we devaluing the importance of asset in our lives and in our work? Well, more importantly, are we eroding between trust? Are we eroding trust between the helper and the helpee? And so I use this analogy. We got a little boy who's 6 years old. His father says, when you turn 10, I'm going to take you to Disney World.
Mm-hmm.
And when the kid turns 10, he takes him to Six Flags. Now, Six Flags is a great amusement park, but it's not Disney World. So how
Mm-hmm.
do you think the little kid feels when for age 6, age 7, age 8, he can't, when I get to be 10, I'm going to Disney World. Then he drives him down the road to Six Flags. And
Mm-hmm.
it's maybe not as perverse as that analogy, but there's some similarities between that. So the people who are relying on us to help them, if we rush to call something they're participating in as wealth building, and they do everything we tell them to do, they show up for every class, they save every penny, they increase their expertise and their education and their certifications. They do everything we tell them to do, and they never get close to being wealthy. How well have we served, and how have we threatened trust by taking that kind of approach? So I think it's important, and I think it's important that we reclaim the value of assets in our lives and in our communities and in the work that we do, and then keep a sharp focus on who has insulated assets and what interventions, what programs, what supports do they need so that those insulated assets can aggregate into wealth one day.
And I think that's what really intrigued me about one, wanting to read your paper, and then two, after I read it, there's a saying, once your mind has been stretched by a new idea, it can never go back to the same size or origin. And that's how I felt after reading this paper. So for those that's tuning in now or tuning in later, I encourage you to read the paper. I encourage you to share it with others within your community, because when I read it, I had to sit back and say, because I do a lot in the community myself. I host and curate business, educational platform events. But when I read it, I was like, you know what, is something being missed? And that, and it then was absolutely yes. There was a huge, because I think the thing that grabbed me was the mislabeling part. We're calling it one thing, but is it that? Is it in essence really that? And that's what's really stood out to me. And then the part that you just said a few seconds ago, is that then hurting trust when we're labeling things one way, but if it's not in fact that, but it's appeasing, or it sounds good into the public eye, we're just going to continue to put it out there. There's an excerpt I'm going to read again in your paper. It says, as a result, wealth building increasingly became an umbrella term for a wide range of programs and policies. It signaled ambition and seriousness, even as the underlying strategies were focused on helping families get started rather than supporting asset growth. It talked about first-time home buyers, in initial savings and business formation. You talk about all of that piece in there, but it's still, you went on to say the last couple of words, but as wealth creation itself, it was labeled as wealth creation.
Mm-hmm. So in the study there, in the paper, it's not really a rigorous study. It's intended to be a thought-provoking piece. This is to get us conversating.
Yes.
I trust that once we start talking about it, we'll land in better places, which is why I really did the paper. It wasn't intended to be necessarily a blueprint, although I do offer a couple of, what do we do next kind of steps at the end of the paper, but it was intended to get the conversation and re-examination going. And so, the whole thing with the labeling and the trust, I think is just really important. In the paper, I use a homeownership example, and I talk about a case study. And I talk about if you buy a $300,000 home and you do everything you've been asked to do, you go to your home ownership classes, you don't miss a payment, you even double up on some payments. After 10 years, you'll have 60,000 in equity. And that's if you don't borrow against it during that time. You don't take out any equity. So let's multiply that times 3, which gets you to a 30-year mortgage. You do everything right for 30 years. You pay all your payments. When you deal with adjusted inflation and other things, the equity you would have in that house would be $180,000. That's 30 years of good behavior. 180,000. 180,000 is not wealth. It is a great asset. And then what is the lifestyle likelihood that at some point over 30 years, you won't cash out some of the equity, that you won't take out money to put your kids through college or help one of your children buy a house or whatever. But I just did perfect scenario. 30 years, all your payments on time, all of your repair, maintenance, and upkeep kept, all of that. And you have $180,000. I don't think we call that wealth. And I don't think we call homeownership wealth building. I did a really kind of perverse scenario. And I'm going to make what I think will be somewhat of an inflammatory statement. But I would love for people to prove me wrong, but most importantly, maybe more likely disagree. I don't think that anyone who ever goes through a financial literacy class is going to be wealthy. I don't know that many, and I'm certain that many who buy homes won't be wealthy. Now, if you're buying a $2.3 million home but if you're buying a $2.3 million home, you're probably already wealthy. But I'm just saying, there's so few scenarios where you do these things that they're calling wealth building that will actually live to wealth. And then just the damage of us demeaning the importance of assets, which is where most of us will likely end up. I mean, is somebody going to say who had assets which protected them from health challenges, economic shocks, changes in their employment, episodic employment threats, but they had enough assets that got them safely through life? Are we going to say, are we going to let them think they failed because they, quote unquote, never got wealthy by valuing the importance of assets and how they perform in our life? I just think this is a conversation that we need to have among ourselves.
Absolutely.
I don't want to claim to say I got all the answers. What I have is an observation of how we're treating things in our work and in our lives and in our messaging. And I think we just need to turn our face back into the wind and see what we're not capturing or treating properly, so that we can have that conversation among ourselves, come to our own agreements about what these things mean to us, how they matter, how they perform, and how we treat them. And then I'll be comforted once we have those conversations openly and more broadly. I wasn't seeing these conversations happen. I have, prior to doing the paper, I've spoken at a number of conferences where I intentionally made the statement to see what response I would get from the audience. And I'm pretty sure that in most of the spaces I've been, no one was thinking of this. This was not something that was being discussed everybody was talking about wealth building, but no one was leaning into the conversation of how we're treating assets and wealth, what the differential is, and why we're calling what are assets for others wealth for ourselves, and how we should be defining them, and then how we should have them operating within the work we do, within the policies we set, within the advocacy work that we do, and more.
Absolutely. And I think that's what really stands out in the paper is the understanding, one, the distinction, and then with understanding the distinction, how do you execute in those pathways? As we pivot the conversation now to talk about some of the solutions or recommendations that you put in your paper, it says, where do we go from here? And you talk about it in 2 different phases, step 1 and step 2. So in step 1, you talk about high impact asset development strategies include home ownership, which you've referenced several times already, business assets. You talk about including bond capacity support, certifications, equipment ownership, operational infrastructure. You talk about education and credentialing. You go on to talk about real labor market demand in different sectors. And then as you talk about the wealth, you go on to talk about and break it down changes to capital access, fund management and investor participation, tax policies, long term institutional purchasing, and land use and housing are some of the ingredients you talk about under step two. Do you want to elaborate about the wealth building part?
Yeah, so I think that I mean, if you kind of look at the philosophy of this, it is a suite of assets that work for you to accumulate wealth. And it's also looking at the difference between the responsibility being on the individuals to accumulate assets, but the burden being on systems to create pathways to wealth. And so when you look at things like changes to capital access, I mean, we all know about predatory lending as something that impacts us whether we're buying a home, but the same thing happens on the business side. The conditions that someone faces trying to own and operate a business, to maybe purchase a building to operate their business in, they end up with very high interest rates. These are all barriers, and they could actually siphon off assets that easily could contribute to that pathway to wealth. One of the things that separates asset from wealth is also shared risk.
Mm-hmm.
And so with asset development, the risk is all on the individual. If I'm going to start a business, I have to put up my house as collateral to get the business loan. There's no shared risk between society, between those say they're wanting to help and the individual. And so if we're going to really create pathways to wealth, we should look at things like public-private shared risks to catalyze people scaling up, whether it's starting a business or growing a business. There are a lot of policies that are in place that are huge barriers to business expansion and growth, like bonding. Like because I work with a supplier initiative here in Washington, I deal with a lot of scaling challenges that growth challenges that businesses face. And I am convinced that large companies via institutions put some of these requirements in place because they knew it would prevent the smaller businesses from ever competing with them.
Mm-hmm.
So I still don't understand past performance bonding. It
Mm-hmm.
just drives me crazy. But for those who may not know, is if you were previously bonded at $7 million for $7 million in work, you're not going to get a $20 million bond. It's too much of a growth thing. And so that locks one of the things that I've observed about particularly our business community is that whatever tier our business is in, they tend to be trapped in those tiers. So if I'm at 5 million in work, it's really hard to get to 10 or 15 or 20. If I'm at 10 million, it's virtually impossible to get to 50. And there are system-based things that do that. So shared risk. I would love to see local governments around the country, for example, for minority businesses that are trying to grow, to have a shared bonding program or to provide a bonding program and not have ridiculously low caps on it. Would love to see more low interest capital, low penalty capital available for people to say, I am not a tax policy expert, but everything that I did in my anecdotal interviews in preparing for this paper has suggested that the tax codes are structured against businesses that operate at a scale that requires some probably national tax reform, but it could be something in local and state taxes that matter as well. So those are some of the things. And see, I guess when you look at that list compared to the other list, I would ask this simple question. How many home ownership programs are you aware of? Lots, right?
Lots, yeah.
How many tax reform programs are you aware of? Not that many.
No.
Right. How many shared risk public sector programs are there? If you hopscotch around the country, you'll find even DC has had or attempted to have a bonding program, but it went away quickly. And so if you look at the amount of activity around, there's a ton of access to capital programs, but I would say they are marginal in their reach and their result. And
Mm-hmm.
so if you look at the stuff that's in the asset development, there's this broad swath of stuff
Yeah.
masquerading as wealth building that
Mm-hmm.
is great as an asset development thing, and we should claim them. So one of the premises of the paper is that we should reclaim asset development as something that's valuable to our community and to
Mm-hmm.
our people. But we should also delineate between that which is asset development and that which is wealth building.
And be very clear about it. That was definitely one of my takeaways, because even when I'm reading the 5 bullet points under your step 2 in terms of how do you move forward, where do you go from here, it says fund management and investor participants creating pathways for the underrepresented individuals and communities to invest in and manage pool capital, going back to what you were saying, sharing returns and influence how it's allocated. And to your point, we will hear about financial literacy workshops every time we turn around. But what you get into step number 2, when you're talking about where do we go from here, those type of conversations are not readily, when every time you turn on TV or be invited to a space. These are not the typical conversations.
Yeah, they're not, and there's a legitimate reason why there's leftovers, and it goes back to one of my premise that there are more people ready for asset development than there are wealth. So I don't
Mm-hmm.
think we should see an equal number.
Mm-hmm.
But it shouldn't be. We're here talking about gaps. There shouldn't be this massive gap
Mm-hmm.
between what we're doing. There should be a differential in scale, but
Mm-hmm.
not a massive gap between what we're doing. There are people of color who have insulated assets. There
Mm-hmm.
should be more than a bank's wealth strategist calling them at random saying, hey, can I talk to you about some investment programs?
Mm-hmm.
There should be more identifiable interventions to help and serve those people who have insulated assets that might actually be able to evolve those into wealth. There
Yeah.
should be the same number. There are more people in need of asset development than wealth, but they should each have their own throne in our lives. Asset
Mm-hmm.
development should have a definable place in our existence, and
Mm-hmm.
wealth building should have an equally treasured one. And we should have managed expectations about how many each is going to reach, but we
Mm-hmm.
should not conflate the two.
Right. And what's realistic is what I'm hearing, what you're saying, what's realistic as well.
Mhm. That's right.
So for those of you that's been listening in, again, we've been having, I think, a very interesting conversation with Mr. Steve. Again, he is the president and CEO of the coalition, which is based in Washington, D.C. Again, you can learn more about the coalition on their website, which is thecoalitiondc.org. When you go to the site, you can also subscribe to their newsletter. I encourage anyone that if you caught the beginning part of this conversation or you're in the middle part of the conversation, I encourage everybody to get a copy and read the white paper that was recently released February of this year. And again, it's entitled Assets Are Not Wealth, Reclaiming Asset Development and Clarifying What Wealth Building Requires. And I think, for those of you that know, we have a business conference coming up. This is going to be a part of that conversation that day at Unlock 2026 Business Conference. So for those of you that may not know, it's going to be on Saturday, April 18th at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. It's going to be an impactful day, a day of education. And when I was introduced to this information, it was with no question in my mind that this needs to be a part of the conversation. Steve, any final words that you would like to share?
Just that I think our community is deserving of our best thinking and our best efforts, and that there are people capable of growing and achieving and developing. And those of us who lead this work have a heightened responsibility to make certain what we're allowing into our community and how it's framed, because we are, in many ways, the standard bearers and the vanguards of the community's trust. And so when others come in to serve, to support, to grow, and to develop, we have to always have a watchful eye on what is happening and take it and make it the best that it can be. And so I believe that something good is going to come out of raising this issue, that it's going to draw attention to it that is going to make people re-examine what they're doing, how they're talking about it, and where it's leading. And then I trust that once our attention is there, that we're going to do the right thing with it, that we're going to make it better, that we're going to ensure it's helping and not hurting and more. So I just say, I feel fortunate that this hit me upside my head one day, and that I was, forthright enough to throw it out there and test it with other people. And it's because of the back and forth engagement that I've had with other thought leaders and other leaders in the work that I kept going to get to this place. And I trust that smarter minds than me will take this and do something with it and come up with some tangible next steps.
So this is step one so what I'm hearing also, just like if somebody was a track star, you're passing the baton on and you want someone to pick it up and keep it going.
Keep it going, expand its impact, push back and disagree, because that's part of what assures us that we're doing the right thing. If there was one thing I just would warn people, none of this was intended to devalue the importance of assets in our life.
Right.
It just was intended to make certain that we're not checking boxes too early in our journey to say that we're helping our people the best way we can.
Absolutely. And I think it's just a piece to if anybody's open to want to continue their learning. That's how I looked at it when I read it. It expanded my mind. It gave me something else to consider, something else to think about for my life, my business, and hopefully it'll impact others as well. So once again, I appreciate you. I appreciate all that you've done in the community. You've made such a huge impact, and I know there's many more things that you're going to continue to do. So thank you for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.